Hola, en este día quiero hacer algo diferente. Quisiera poner un video que creo que muchos no vieron con respecto a un nuevo libro. El video fue puesto por CLIE y en él está entrevistando la profesora Lidia Rodríguez, que ella enseña en la Universidad de Deusto, allá en España, y está entrevistando a Beth Allison Barr, que es la autora del libro La construcción de la feminidad bíblica, cómo se convirtió la subyugación de las mujeres en doctrina cristiana. Y esto es bien importante porque este libro ya lo oí y he oído un sinfín de entrevistas a la autora. Y ahora la autora está sacando otro, va a sacar otro libro que sigue el mismo tema. La autora ha sido bautista del sur. Ella cuenta su historia de cómo vio a su esposo, cómo esto de la subyugación de la mujer, el esposo lo vivió siendo él un líder o pastor de jóvenes. Ustedes lo oirán todo eso en la entrevista. Pero lo que a mí me llama la atención es de que esto está tomando más estudio desde que se descubrió, o mejor dicho, se afirmó de que Junias era mujer y no hombre, como siempre se ha enseñado. Esto ha creado bastante que hablar. Se ha tenido que revisionar el Ministerio de la Mujer, más cuando se dice que la mujer, personas como Albert Mohler han dicho que nunca la mujer ha tenido liderazgo dentro de una comunidad de fe o iglesia, y Beth Allison Barr en el próximo libro que ella está preparando, y unas cosas que yo también he estado oyendo últimamente, es de que se les olvida a ellos de que han habido monasterios que han sido liderados por mujeres. Entonces, se tiene que tomar la historia en cuenta, no solamente la historia recién. Y me ha gustado mucho este libro, yo lo recomiendo mucho, espero también tenerlo en español pronto. Pero si ustedes lo pueden comprar, van a ver los links abajo, tanto para CLIE y también para Amazon, para que ustedes lo puedan comprar este libro. Pero una de las cosas que sí les voy a decir, y es como una advertencia, no mala advertencia, sino que una buena advertencia, este libro abre los ojos. Yo había oído ya de todo esto, lo había leído ya también, pero lo bueno de Allison Barr es que él lo está sintetizando todo y lo está poniendo todo en un solo libro para disponibilidad de nosotros. En el mundo de la hispana, y algunos también allá en España y mucho en Latinoamérica, ser de sana doctrina es oponerse a cualquier ministerio que el Señor le ha dado. Y hemos visto cómo muchos personajes de rechazar totalmente hasta las mujeres cualquier ministerio, aún la predicación, y ahora están aceptando el ministerio de la predicación de la mujer, pero con tal de que ellos den las conferencias den las charlas en esas conferencias que hacen las mujeres. Hemos visto un cambio, y a veces que no es tanto por lo que la Biblia dice, sino más bien en el caso de las conferencias por dinero o porque ven que pueden atraer más gente a su ideología. Entonces, este libro ayuda a comprender cómo esto tomó lugar, cómo esto salió y cómo que muchos quieren regresar a los años 50 del siglo pasado eso es lo ideal. Y si ustedes se fijan que muchos de los memes de los que le tiran a este movimiento woke, muchos de ellos son fotos de los años 50. Entonces, los años 50 es cuando se idealiza esa época. Y eso es peligroso. ¿Por qué? Porque en los años 50 aquellos que lo vivieron sabían que estaban amenazados a una guerra nuclear. Entonces, los años 50 no es lo ideal para vivir en esos tiempos. Pero ya eso lo tenemos que ver como historiadores. Por último, me gustaría decir de que este libro a mí me gustó bastante, porque como dije anteriormente, sintetizó todo lo que yo había leído tanto de Grudem como también de Kinner y de otros autores. Y bueno, ir a ver eso. Pero Beth Allison Barr, ella es historiadora de eso, lo que ella enseña en la Universidad Baylor, y allá en Estados Unidos, y ella enseña más que todo historia del Renacimiento, de los 1500 por ahí, de por esa etapa, pero también enseña otras pequeñas cosas, y por eso es que se ha tomado el tiempo para hacer este libro. Bueno, yo les dejo esta entrevista, espero que sea de mucha información, primeramente, para que así podamos contrarrestar a ciertos argumentos en contra del Ministerio de la Mujer que de por sí suenan muy débiles, hay veces irracionales, muchas veces no bíblicos, que están forzando la Biblia para que diga algo que no dice. Y este libro les va a ayudar para contestar esas objeciones. Así que, como una vez más les repito, van a ver los links abajo para comprarlo tanto de CLIE o de Amazon, y con eso ayudan a este canal. Que Dios les bendiga y hasta la próxima.
Me gustaría dar la bienvenida a todas y a todos los que nos están siguiendo en directo en este nuevo número o esta nueva edición de Conociendo al Autor. Así que bienvenidos, bienvenidas en nombre de CLIE y de HarperCollins a este nuevo episodio de Conociendo al Autor. Permítanme que me presente muy brevemente. Soy Lidia Rodríguez, profesora de Antiguo Testamento de la Facultad de Teología de la Universidad de Deusto, y colaboro además con la Facultad de Teología SEUT, y entre los ministerios en los que sirvo al mundo evangélico de lengua hispana, pues pertenezco al comité de dirección de Sociedad Bíblica y al comité de redacción de una revista orientada especialmente a América Latina, como es la revista Biblia y Teología Hoy. Y en esta ocasión no vengo a hablar de mí misma, ni muchísimo menos. Me siento muy honrada de presentar, y hablaremos con ella brevemente, a la doctora Beth Allison Barr. Ella es la autora de un libro que acaba de traducirse al castellano hace muy poco, La construcción de la feminidad bíblica, y cuyo subtítulo es de lo más interesante: Cómo se convirtió la subyugación de las mujeres en doctrina bíblica. Beth Allison Barr es catedrática de historia en la Universidad de Baylor, en Texas, donde ella se especializó en historia medieval, en historia de la mujer y en historia de la iglesia. Así que es una mujer altamente capacitada para el tema que nos va a ocupar en este caso. Ella además es presidenta de la Conferencia sobre Fe e Historia y es miembro de la Asociación de Cristianas por la Igualdad Bíblica en Estados Unidos. Barr además es muy conocida en Estados Unidos porque colabora en diferentes medios periodísticos, algunos de ellos realmente muy famosos y de una amplia audiencia: Christianity Today, el Washington Post, Religions News Service, y además ella es colaboradora habitual en un sitio web muy conocido también, Paseos sobre Historia Cristiana, The Anxious Bench. Así que me gustaría dar la bienvenida, sin más dilación, a Beth Allison Barr. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. A partir de ahora vamos a hablar en inglés, pero al tiempo que estamos hablando en inglés, ustedes podrán ver cómo de manera simultánea van apareciendo los subtítulos en castellano. Bien, como digo, vamos a comenzar con la presentación. So, Beth, thank you so much. Thank you very much for having you here for the Spanish audience. Most welcome.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
So I would like to put some questions to you, so feel free just to go up or just will jump if you like to a different one. But I would like you to ask, first of all, about the title of your book, because this title may seem a little curious, intriguing to a non-English speaker. What do you mean? What do we mean by the title Biblical Womanhood?
That's a fantastic question. Biblical womanhood is a phrase that became popular in North American Christianity, really just North American evangelicalism, in the 90s. It's actually a relatively recent phrase, and it is a phrase that was popularized by a growing theology that we also know as complementarianism. And complementarianism is the idea that women are divinely ordained by God to be subordinate to men, and that they are called to follow male leadership in the home and in the church. And the term complementarian itself was actually formulated in the late 1980s because the men who were espousing, and they were a group of men who were espousing this theology, decided that patriarchy was not as popular a word. So they chose the word complementarian. And then with the idea of complementarian is that it models a biblical way of living. And hence, this is how we get to the term biblical womanhood, that to be a biblical woman is to be a woman who lives under the authority of her husband, father, or male pastor at home and in church.
So I guess this has something to do with your biography, so to say. Let me just read in Spanish a
Sure.
little. I will quote you, but in Spanish. Para quienes nos están siguiendo en directo, permítanme que me dirija un momento a ustedes en castellano, porque veremos cómo en la página 38 del libro de Allison Barr, ella afirma lo siguiente: este libro es mi historia. Una mujer blanca cuyas experiencias como esposa de pastor y estudiosa me han llevado a rechazar las enseñanzas evangélicas sobre el liderazgo masculino y la sumisión femenina, que es lo que acabamos de escuchar hace unos momentos. Y sigue diciendo la cita en la página 38. Mi lucha contra el patriarcado es por las mujeres. Pero las mujeres no son las únicas perjudicadas por el patriarcado. So, Beth, let me ask you another question.
Mhm.
I just wrote from your book. The starting point of this book is at some point autobiographical. And
Yeah.
in several chapters as well, you also share some traumatic experiences of Christian women from different denominations. We don't have time to read some examples, but I will ask to put on the screen some of them as we are answering that second question. In your opinion, what is the importance of personal
Mhm.
experience when it comes to academic reflection, as you have done? Because many people say, well, we don't have to mix both things, but you do. Why?
Yeah. No, because of the audience that I was writing to. I am a historian, I am an academic, and so the book is based upon academic research. But at the same time, my audience was not the academic audience. My audience was the church. And when we think about how we communicate in the church, and especially in my experience, I grew up Southern Baptist. I grew up in which we would consider in the evangelical world. And our experience was to share testimonies. That's one of the very first things I remember being taught was how to share my testimony. And so when I was writing for an evangelical audience, the most natural thing to do is to share my testimony. And that's exactly what the book is. It's a combination of my testimony with my academic expertise.
So, quite interesting. La audiencia tiene la oportunidad, quienes nos están siguiendo en directo, de tener acceso precisamente a esta página y a otras de manera libre y gratuita. Verán cómo aparece en el chat de este encuentro un enlace desde donde, como digo, se pueden descargar gratuitamente la introducción y el primer capítulo, en el que ya descubrimos la enorme importancia del testimonio personal a la base de este libro. So, Beth, in this book you use the expression Christian patriarchy. For
Yes.
some people, it might seem really hard to hear those words.
Yes.
But in your opinion, what would characterize what is very, so to say, typical from that Christian patriarchy you're
Mhm.
writing about in the book?
Yeah, so I am a women's historian. And so patriarchy is a term that we talk about quite frequently. And I have a joke now in the US that since the since the Barbie movie came out, I don't have to explain, if anyone in the audience has seen the Barbie movie, I don't have to explain what patriarchy means anymore,
That's
which is
funny.
so nice. It makes it so easy. But patriarchy is simply a term that scholars use to describe cultures in which men are the leaders, and which, in fact, it's not just men are the leaders, but the society actually, the norm for that culture and society is the masculine norm. And so this is why you talk about people. And then when you're referencing a female audience, you talk about, women in the audience. And so the normalization is that you're speaking to men. And so patriarchy is simply a term for cultures that are male focused and in which men are primarily the leaders. And so, as I referenced the Barbie movie, even if you haven't seen it, the Barbie movie was actually the opposite of this, in which it was a matriarchy, where it was Barbie and all of her friends who were the Supreme Court justices and who were in all of the positions in their government. And that's essentially what patriarchy is. And so my use of the term Christian patriarchy is just thinking about the way that our churches are structured and in which mostly it is men in pastoral roles, and men in the primary leadership roles. The structures in the North American church, we think about men are mostly the elders and the deacons, and where women can do things in the church, and many of them do have influential and significant roles, it is always if they acquiesce to male authority. And so even in churches in which women might be in pastoral positions, possibly even preaching pastoral positions, they have to do so by acknowledging that they are covered by their husbands, that they are speaking with the authority of male leaders, because the assumption in Christian patriarchy is that women have to be covered by male leadership, which means that it is mostly men who are sitting at the table and making the decisions about the church, as well as, and this is a significant problem in the U.S. church right now, and that is we have this spate of this sexual abuse crisis, which is just spinning out of control right now, and this is a direct consequence of churches that have only had men sitting at the table and deciding whose voices to hear. And women's voices in these circumstances are less likely to be heard and less likely to be believed than the men who are sitting in leadership. So that is what I mean by Christian patriarchy. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more if you want me to explain that better.
Mhm. Yes, because you were talking of sexual abuse. Maybe this is the worst or the most obvious way of abuse.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
would you say there is also some kind of spiritual abuse
Yes. Yes.
directly related to Christian patriarchy?
Yes, exactly. I mean, if we just have to think about it. If women are taught from very young ages, and I always picture my daughter here, she's 14 years old, and so I always think about her. And if we think about how children are taught from very young ages that women they can do things in the church, but it's always to be in these subordinate roles, and that their voices can never be in leadership like they're the boys who they are playing with. And this really came, I think I really understood the significance of this when my husband and I were still in youth ministry in this complementarian church, and I heard my husband, who was explaining why he was allowing one of the female students to teach part of the Bible in class that day. And it's not something he ever had to do when the male students practice teaching. And so he had to explain. And I was sitting there and I was thinking, what are we teaching these young kids when women are being told that their voices do not stand alone, cannot carry the same authority as these male students in the room, not because of their training, not because of their expertise, not because of even their natural inclinations or their giftings, but simply because their bodies are female, that there is something about the female body that makes her less than the male body. And that is a really dangerous lesson to teach young girls. And if I can add, since I published the Making a Biblical Womanhood in English, and since then it has gone out, it's now I think in three languages that it's been translated into now. But one of the continuing responses I get is from women who write to me and tell me that for the first time they understand that God truly sees them as equal to men and in the same way, and that they are not less because they are created as women. And it just breaks my heart, because that's the lesson of Christian patriarchy, is that women are worth less in the eyes of God.
So to say you have to apologize for being a woman, quite interesting.
Yes.
Sad lesson we have to
Yes.
hear still in churches. In fact, you also tell in this book that you needed some time to become aware of your situation, of the painful reality experienced by so many women in evangelical churches. And I think this is still the same for many women in evangelical churches in Spain as well. So how can we help Christian congregations to deal with that situation that is so often hidden? No women, no men, no church leaders are aware of this situation. How can we help?
Yeah. So I think we have to be gracious, and understand that most people, the reason they believe that women are not to be in authority positions and to be really almost eternally under male authority, is because this is what they have been taught. They have been taught this by pastors that they respect, who have been taught this in seminaries, who have been taught this in evangelical literature. And so this is not usually people who want to oppress others. This is simply the way that we have been taught, that to live as a Christian, women are primarily called to be under male leadership and to be focused on home and children. And so I think we have to be gracious with that, and we have to realize that it's going to take a lot of time for some people to unravel this. And even for women who feel like something is wrong, I think the women who are most attuned to this are women who feel called to do something different. For women who feel called to vocational work outside the home, for women who feel called to leadership within churches, to ministry within churches. And they are going to feel this the most acutely, the most, I think, sooner than women who really feel like they are doing what they are called to do, which is being in the home, being focused on children, and serving in roles that don't require them to be in authority over men. And for those women, I think it's hardest for them to understand that their situational calling is not the calling for all women. And so I think we have to, on both sides of this, we have to approach with a lot of grace, and we have to give people time. And so I think, it took me years of really teaching this and reading the scripture for myself and reading the words of other people to unravel this. And so I remind myself all the time that I need to give other people that same time as well, to let them figure this out for themselves.
So time is important here, but
It
as
is.
I understand you, uh, teaching the Bible properly, so to say,
Yes.
is also an issue here. And
Yes.
in your book, you also go through all these typical biblical texts that are used for female subordination. For example,
Mhm.
Colossians chapter 3, Ephesians chapter 5, 1 Corinthians chapter 14. All those, so to say, wedding texts that are often
Yes.
used for female subordination. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to go through each of these texts.
Mhm.
But could you give us some hint, some focus, so
Yeah.
that we don't slip into this subordination
Yes, indeed.
interpretation of the
No,
text?
that's a fantastic question. And as I said, I think one of the reasons that people believe this is because of the way we have been taught to view scripture, and we have taught been taught to trust our translations and our commentators on that scripture. And so I have a couple of things that I think can help. First of all, these texts that you mentioned, Phyllis Tribble calls them the texts of terror for women, because they are the ones when we think about, and I'm speaking from my context in North America, but whenever there was a sermon on gender roles or a sermon on how to be a woman in Christianity, it always started with one of these texts. It started with First Timothy 2, saying women are to be learn in silence under male authority. It started with First Corinthians 14, let your women be silent in churches. It started also with these household codes that wives are called to submit to their husbands, and which these texts are in the Bible, and we have to deal with them. However, can you imagine what if we didn't start with these texts? Like, what if these sermons on what it is to be a woman in the church, we actually started with Romans 16, which is a passage where Paul is going through and talking about all of his coworkers, and he lists 10 women in that passage, and he calls them all out, several of them by names, and he gives them the title of apostle, Junia. He gives them the title of deacon. He gives them the title of, some of them are clearly house church leaders. And so if we started with Romans 16, it would help us understand that whatever First Timothy 2 is saying or First Corinthians 14 is saying, it can't be saying that women are not ever to be in leadership and aren't ever to teach, because Paul himself talks about women who are in leadership and who are teaching, and he calls them, his good coworkers who are helping him, and he's so grateful for them, and that they are noteworthy, that they are, that they are acknowledged among and respected among the apostles. So we cannot, even though we see these texts of subordination in the Bible, they are not the only thing that's in the Bible. We also see women clearly in these leadership positions, and it would be unethical to not realize that we have both female leadership as well as texts that do portray these misogynist patriarchal attitudes. And so we have to recognize both of them. So that would be the one piece of advice that I think I would say, is that we can't only focus on the text of subordination. We have to also realize all of the places that women are teaching and leading and are regarded as full equals alongside men. I could even go back to the old, to the Hebrew Bible with Deborah. So she's also a very fun one, because she is the only judge who is a seated judge, which means that she carries the authority, and the only other seated judge mentioned in the Bible is Moses. And so Deborah carries the authority, the same authority of Moses. And, we cannot say women are not allowed to be preachers and leaders in the church with images of Deborah sitting there judging the people alongside, the way Moses had done in the past. So we have to remember that both of those texts are there. I think the other thing is we need to pay attention to how much Bible translation matters. And most people today choose one translation of the Bible and focus primarily on that one, and they don't use a whole lot of other Bible translations. One of the most prominent Bible translations in my evangelical world in North America is what is called the ESV, the English Standard Version of the Bible. And the English Standard Version of the Bible is about 90 to 95% the Revised Standard Version of the Bible. So it's the RSV, what we call the RSV in English Bible translations. But the ESV was translated specifically by people who supported female subordination. And the primary texts that they change in the ESV are to reinforce female subordination. And so they do things like minimize women's leadership roles. They do things, they do the changes that they make are small, but they are all designed to emphasize female subordination. For example, one of the most infamous changes that they tried to make is in the creation story in Genesis, in which the curse is delivered. And the long understanding of the curse is that women are cursed to be under your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you. And this is the curse of patriarchy. And so the question is why do we want to live in the curse? This is the cursed flaw. This idea of oppression of women is part of the curse. So we are called to live beyond that. Well, they changed that to say that your desire will be contrary to your husband, yet he will still rule over you. And this is a very minor change, but what it is saying is that instead of patriarchy being the curse is women who resist patriarchy. And yet men will still lead despite the sinfulness of women. And that is a very insidious change. And so I think it really matters to pay attention to who translated your Bible. And I recommend using more than one translation. That's my primary, and by different types of translators.
So thank you very much. Para quienes nos están viendo en este momento, espero que les esté resultando interesante, como me está resultando muy interesante a mí esta entrevista con la doctora historiadora Beth Allison Barr. De nuevo, verán cómo aparece en el chat ese enlace desde el que pueden descargarse gratuitamente estas partes del libro. So, Beth, let me sum up somehow what you've been talking about. It is very important to take seriously the Bible as a whole, not only pick up some very interested text for women's subordination. You also have talked about the translation. Please do not read just one single translation, compare. And also the importance of context to read the Bible. But let me add another issue. Tradition.
Yes.
Christian tradition. Because in your book, you also revisit the importance of women in Christian origins. You write about the sisters Martha and Mary Magdalene, Phoebe, and Eunice also. We're talking Eunice, the apostle Eunice in Romans chapter 16. But as you very well know, in Western culture, Mary Magdalene is a repentant prostitute, not part of Jesus' followers. Is that the real portrayal of this woman, repentant prostitute?
No, that has actually been as you said, a church tradition. It is an old church tradition. What happened is in the years between the beginning of Christianity and the spread of Christianity in Europe, and also moving out from what we would consider to be the biblical world. And so sort of that crossover. And what we found that some of the leaders who are teaching Christianity, they simplify things. And so often what they would do is they would conflate people in the Bible, and they would conflate them with some popular saints, like, for example, a saint named Mary of Egypt, who was a very popular early saint who was known for her asceticism, her fasting out in the desert, etc. And then the reason she was this is because she was a repentant prostitute. And then we also bring in, I was just actually on a dissertation defense last week, and one of the questions asked, it was a global Christianity defense. And so the student was actually talking about the early church in Ethiopia. And what we began to realize as a committee is that this early Ethiopian church was not influenced by the theological teachings of Augustine. And if you think about Augustine, I mean, he's the Trinity, of course, we often think about the theology of the Trinity, but we also think about the theology of original sin and this emphasis on the sinfulness of the sexual act. And with this also this emphasis, and one of the things that Augustine is known for is having trouble putting away. He believed he was being called to be celibate, but he had a lot of trouble in putting away his wife. And one of his famous sayings is, God, give me chastity, but not yet. That's often attributed to him. And so he sort of had this idea of women as these sexual creatures that were scary and men needed to stay away from. And this infiltrated early Christianity, and it infiltrated the way that we read, these early Christians read biblical text. And so women who were actually not sexually sinful people got imbued with these sexually sinful qualities. And Mary Magdalene is one of these. She becomes conflated with the woman with the alabaster jar. She becomes conflated with the sister, with Mary and Martha of Bethany. And by the 7th century, we have most of the Western church has identified Mary Magdalene as this prostitute, this repentant prostitute who anoints the feet of Jesus and who is also the sister of Martha and Lazarus. But I think another part of that tradition too that we forget now in the modern world is that the early medieval church did not leave Mary Magdalene as a repentant prostitute. They actually saw her as one of the in crowd of the followers of Jesus. They emphasized the fact that she was at the cross when the men fled away. They emphasized the fact that she was the first one, as John tells us, that she was the first one who encountered the resurrected Christ, and that she was trusted with the gospel to go and give the good news to the apostles that Jesus was risen. And so because of this, the early medieval church called Mary Magdalene the apostle to the apostles, which meant that they saw her as the first preacher of the gospel who was invested with that authority by Jesus himself. And this accounts for the fact that we have a tradition of women preaching with full authority in the early medieval and into the medieval church. They are always more anomalous than men, but it is because of that reputation and that belief that Mary Magdalene was entrusted with the word of God to preach the word of God by Jesus himself. So there is the tradition of the repentant prostitute, but there's also the tradition of the preaching Mary Magdalene, which I think is really important for us to remember today.
Very interesting. You would also have contested Christian traditions within Christianity here.
Yes,
So the
yes,
Western one, the Eastern one. And it is very interesting that this other, so to say, portrayal of Mary Magdalene as a preaching leader
yeah,
also influenced and inspired medieval women. You
yes.
are a scholar, an expert in medieval history, and you also introduce in your book those women of great significance. For example, in Spanish, we call her Cristina de Pizan,
Oh, yes.
Christine of Pizan. Can you tell us something about this prominent woman?
Oh, Christine de Pizan. Yes, she's one of my favorite women to teach. And I am a late medievalist, so I work mostly in the late 14th and the 15th century, which means Christine de Pizan is exactly in my wheelhouse here. One of my favorite texts that I teach by Christine de Pizan is a poem that she wrote at the very end of her life, in which she is talking about Joan of Arc, which is another woman that some of your listeners may, and Joan of Arc is, of course, that teenage girl who helps turn the tide of the French war against the English, the 100 Years' War. And after her first successful battle, where this young teenage girl is leading the French army in success against the English, Christine de Pizan writes this beautiful poem in which she says, the sun is smiling, the sun is shining again. And it's all because God has given us this woman to lead, to essentially to revive the French. And she says that Joan of Arc does something that not 100,000 men could have done. And I think, you can hear the delight in Christine de Pizan's voice, because one of the things Christine de Pizan has spent her life doing is writing about why women are worthy in the eyes of God as well as in the eyes of society, and that women have always been a critical part. She wrote a book called The City of Ladies, in which she was going through and systematically refuting misogynist ideas about women that said women aren't as capable as men, that women cannot be used in the same ways as men, that women can't, serve in leadership positions. And she's methodically goes through history, showing all of the women who have played pivotal roles and have done great things for both their countries as well as also for the church. So Christine de Pizan had her eye on the importance of ideas about women. And in fact, she actually says that one of the reasons she writes this book is because she knows of a woman whose husband beats her regularly and says that it's because women, are so evil and they can't do these, they can't do these things. And she says this man had these ideas, learned these ideas about women, and because of this, he mistreated his wife. And so, she has this idea that the ideas about women aren't just something for us to think about. They aren't just something that's philosophical, but they have real consequences. And for this woman that she knew, the consequences were her husband beating her because he did not believe that women were worth the same as men. And so Christine de Pizan spent a good part of her life, and her bio is actually really interesting. She was married at a young age. She's actually from Italy. Her husband was her father was in the court of the French king. She marries at a young age, a love match to an aristocrat in the French court, and he actually dies early on, and she ends up becoming being the breadwinner for her family and for supporting her children, as well as the other relatives who live with her. And she does it by being a professional writer. And so, which launches her into this world that is mostly male dominated. And so she's an absolute fantastic story, not only of a woman who does amazing things, but a woman who recognizes the impact of dangerous ideas on women and actually fights against it using history as well as the Bible.
Very interesting and a very current problem right now, violence against women. So
Yes.
some people would call these 14th century women as a feminist avant la lettre, maybe.
Yes,
Very,
indeed.
very interesting. There are many, many interesting women in your book, and Christine de Pizan is only one of them. But your work does not ignore some criticism towards the Protestant Reformation. Not
Yeah.
everything was good, precisely because of its reaction, Luther, Calvin, and others, to the demands of the women of that time, because women wanted also to feel free. And very often they didn't have the opportunity, and they also were inspired by, for example, Mary Magdalene. But maybe one of the famous women of that time was Katharina von Bora. Sadly, she is barely known just as Luther's wife. Why?
Yeah. Yes. So the Reformation, as I said, this is something that I think Protestants often are always wanting to talk about how good the Reformation was. And I always put out there that I'm a Baptist. I am die to the wool Protestant, although I have a lot of empathy and beauty of the Catholic tradition. But at the same time, I agree with Protestant theology. But what Protestant theology did was that it introduced the idea that the primary calling for women was to be wives, was to get married and to be wives. And this indeed has stayed the primary calling. If you think about the Protestant church, the emphasis on what women are supposed to do is to get married, which is also why so many single women today feel left out of the evangelical world, because the emphasis is on and the worth is placed on women who are married with children. So Catherine von Bora was a female monastic. She was a nun who was inspired by the writings of Luther and others like him, and escaped. Essentially, there's a very dramatic story that's told about her and several other nuns who escape in a cart in the dead of night. And most of her female monastic sisters end up getting married off to some of the early reformers. And Catherine von Bora herself finds herself married to Martin Luther. And I have a friend at Baylor who actually is a Reformation historian who works primarily on Luther. So I've learned so much from him about the relationship between Luther and Catherine von Bora. And one of the things that he emphasizes is that Martin Luther didn't know how to be married. This was something that was new to him, was new for Catherine von Bora, who grew up in a nunnery, who had lived her, up as an adult in a nunnery. So they are trying to kind of figure out, what does it mean to be in this Protestant marriage? And one of the, what we know is that Martin Luther emphasized over and over again masculine authority. But at the same time, we also know that during his life, Catherine von Bora had a lot of freedom within his household, and that she actually argued with him about theological matters. We know that she engaged in theological debates at the dinner table with a lot of these early reformers. And in fact, their words were recorded in conversations today that we know as table talk. We also know that she was the one who kept Martin Luther's life together. She managed him. She was in charge of all of the finances in the home. From what we can tell, Luther was really bad with money. And the only reason there was enough food on the table for his ever-growing family was because of Catherine von Bora, because she was such a good manager of the household, as well as a manager of her husband. And through this, she met a lot of people in Luther's life and all of these influential reformers, which makes what happened to her so even more tragic. Because when Martin Luther died, Catherine von Bora and her family were in some ways abandoned by these early reformers, who had hung around and who had been learned by and inspired by Luther. But without Luther, Catherine von Bora was a widow. She was a woman without a man. She was a woman without a livelihood within this growing, new church that taught that the best thing a woman could be was married with children. And now she could no longer be that wife. And Catherine von Bora actually dies in poverty, because she could no longer support herself without Luther, and she did not get help from the other reformers. Nobody stepped in to help her as a woman alone. And so her story, I think, really emphasizes the tragedy, the danger of a type of theology that only emphasizes women in relationship to a man. Because when they don't have that relationship with a man, then it leaves them pretty much out in the cold. And so Catherine von Bora died alone in poverty.
So poverty is another form of violence against women
Yes,
in this case.
yes, I would say so.
Bueno, estamos llegando al final de esta entrevista. Gracias a quienes nos estáis siguiendo en directo en esta entrevista. Y de nuevo, podréis ver que aparece en el chat el banner desde el que podéis descargaros en la introducción y el primer capítulo de esta obra, que espero que esté despertando su interés. Como veis, como ven ustedes, atraviesa un amplio rango de la historia. Y ahora ya le lanzaré la última de las preguntas. So, Beth, thank you so much. I think
Yes.
it is a very inspiring book, and I think I'm pretty sure of that. This will be a very important book for Spanish churches. So, just one last question
Mhm.
to end with that very interesting interview. In your opinion, what is at stake when equality of men and women is denied in church today?
Yeah. I think actually the gospel is at stake. I think that if for Christians to live in the world and to show the love of Christ in a way that other people want to hear about who Jesus is and to hear the gospel, when they see Christians treating women as no better than everyone else in the world treats women, and in fact, in some ways worse than the world treats women. This is something that I've emphasized. We know that in the ancient world, women were in leadership positions in the ancient Roman world and the Jewish world. And so if for Christians to argue that Paul meant for women to never teach and lead, that is actually a more restrictive role than what we find in the culture in which the New Testament was born. And so when the church treats women as less than men, and in fact, when we see these sex abuse crises, which are rocking the North American church right now, all it does is it gives God a bad name and it limits the spread of the gospel. And I just hope people listening to this would just think, what if we lived in a world where how God gifted women and men was between them and God? And that women who were gifted to preach, teach, and lead were not limited because of cultural ideas, but they were allowed to flourish and they were supported. Can we imagine how Christianity would look today if that was the case? And so I just want to encourage people who believe in female subordination to just ask themselves, what if you're wrong? Are you willing to consider that maybe God did not place limits on women the way that our world does today?
Thank you very much, Beth. Very inspiring, your last sentence here. Thank you very much for your engagement with church and your academic work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.